You might not be a leader of 2 million people out of slavery in a country. Okay, neither am I. But every one of us is a leader in some way, shape, or form because God has called you to lead at work, at home, at church, in your neighborhood, in various groups that you're a part of. If you're part of a knitting club, you're actually supposed to be a leader in the knitting club. You are called to be coaches, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, fifth cousins. There's all of us have been called to lead in some way, shape, or form. And what we're looking at this morning is leadership and leading in the midst of challenging times. Now, Moses certainly faced quite a few challenges and some very challenging times. The task that he was given by God is just huge. I mean, confront the most powerful man in the world and demand that he let all these 2 million slaves go. Just let them go. Not buying them off, not giving them anything, just going there and telling him, let them go. Now, as I've been working on this message, given that I do a lot of work with kids, for the past 2 weeks, that good old VBS/camp/Sunday school/youth group song has just been burrowing through my head. Pharaoh, Pharaoh, ooh. No, I'm not going to dance. Ooh, let my people go. Yeah, you know that. I hope it is stuck in your head for the next week because, man, it's still all week it's been in my head. But we're going to pick up in chapter 5. That's where we're picking up this morning. And just the first 2 verses of chapter 5, we get the lay of what's going on. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." All right, so like I said, we're going to talk about leading in challenging times, and here we now have the first kind of what I'd say characteristic about leadership and leading in challenging times. There will be opposition. You can expect it. It's coming. Started right off the bat for Moses. I mean, this is the first time he comes up to Pharaoh and says, "Hey, here's what God said." And Pharaoh immediately says, "God who? I don't know the Lord. I am not letting you go." And so the next 6 chapters, we have this drama, this beautiful story that unfolds between Moses, Pharaoh, and God. Because Pharaoh ignored God's command, doesn't even recognize him, says, "I don't know who this is. I'm not letting him go." And God, in turn, unleashes a series of plagues upon Egypt and the Egyptians. And these plagues were meant to be a sign. Were meant to tell Pharaoh that God is powerful. This was a demonstration of God's power, that he could basically defy all the laws of science. This was a demonstration to Pharaoh that God is alone the one true God, because back then, Pharaoh was seen as a god. This is a god going against another god. And these also were meant to convince Pharaoh, you might want to listen, you might want to do as you're told, and you might want to let the Israelites go. So the water gets turned to blood. This is very gross. Then came the frogs. I don't like frogs. I like them better than gnats, though. I really don't like gnats, because gnats is what came after that. And then flies. And then the death of livestock, which is not a good thing, especially if you like to eat livestock. Not good. Then came boils. Then hail. Then locusts. Then darkness. And we're not talking about just like what Kara's experiencing up in Alaska where it's dark 22 hours out of the day. We're talking about a darkness you can't even see in front of your face. 9 horrible plagues. 9 times God struck Egypt, made them miserable, made their lives miserable. 9 times he struck Egypt. 9 times he demonstrated how powerful he is. 9 times Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." Excuse me. And 9 times either Pharaoh dug in his heels out of just sheer arrogance, dug in his heels and refused to let them go, or just flat out lied and said, okay, call it off, and I'll let your people go. And God would call off the plague, and he'd be like, nah, never mind. No, we're not letting them go. I don't know about you, but that is some pretty serious opposition. Moses is up against it. I mean, if I were Moses, I think I'd be feeling pretty frustrated. You know that old saying, 3rd time's a charm? Yeah. 9th time's a charm? I mean, that's got to be what he's thinking. He's like, how long is this going to go? I mean, just over and over and over. I mean, what are you going to plague us with next? I mean, they just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and Pharaoh just will not quit. He will not give in. But God had one more plague. He had one plague left, one that he knew would be Pharaoh's breaking point. As stubborn and arrogant as Pharaoh was, God knew this would be his breaking point. And this is found in chapter 11, starting right at the beginning in verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. So what was the one thing? What was that one plague that would be Pharaoh's breaking point? Death. Death was the breaking point. The death of the firstborn son of everyone and everything. Not just humans, even the poor livestock got affected by this. The firstborn son of all the animals died too. The only exception to this plague would be to those households that had obeyed God, had sacrificed a lamb, had taken some of that blood and spread it on the sides and the top of the door frames of their home. Those are the only ones who would be spared. So at midnight, the final plague takes place. Chapter 12, verses 29 through 30. Excuse me. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. It was Pharaoh's breaking point. It was Pharaoh's breaking point. He said, fine, leave. And they were allowed to leave. He finally not only said they could leave, but actually let them leave. You know, in spite of this fierce opposition, despite how dug in Pharaoh was, Moses held firm to what God had called him to do. I mean, think about that. 9 different times he goes, and 9 times it's fruitless. And he's got to be wondering, when is this cycle going to end? But he didn't stop. He stayed faithful to the calling, and he kept going and demanding for Pharaoh to let the people go. And he finally does. Now, that'd be cool if that were the end of the story. We could say, and all the Israelites, traipsed off to the promised land and lived happily ever after. But we know that that is not how the story goes. Look at chapter 14, moving ahead a few more chapters. See, I told you, we're going to be going through these. Chapter 14, verses 5 through 9. This is when Pharaoh kind of realizes this was not a good decision. He says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them. And he said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready. He took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth opposite Baal-zephon. So, they had all those plagues. They let the Israelites go, and all of a sudden Pharaoh looks around and said, oh man, we got to do all this work. I don't want to do all this work. We just lost 2 million people. We lost a lot of workers. This was not a good idea. Let's go get them. Let's go get them back. And so he sends out his army, the most powerful army in the world. He sends them out after the Israelites, and of course they catch up to them. Now, Moses, who probably was, feeling a sense of relief when they were finally allowed to leave, that all of that nonsense was over, is now facing a really horrible situation. Just when he thought the opposition was over, now he faces the impossible. On one side of all of these people, all the Israelites, they've got this gigantic body of water. There's no Chautauqua Bridge, there's no ferry running across, there's no tunnel, there's no big boat to jump on, Can you imagine that, a boat that fits 2 million people? That'd be impressive. But they got this huge body of water they can't cross, and then the other side of them is the most powerful army in the world. You know that old saying, find yourself between a rock and a hard place? I think this is when that might have been invented. Because they found themselves between a rock and a hard place. What are you supposed to do? This is impossible. Well, that leads us to the second characteristic of leading in challenging times. You will face seemingly insurmountable circumstances. The Israelites were terrified, and they had every right to be, because they're trapped. They cannot go anywhere. Can't try to swim across the Red Sea, and they certainly can't face the most powerful army in the world. They got no weapons. There might be 2 million of them, but a lot of those are women and children who really aren't keen to fight. So they cry out. They cry out to Moses. Now, excuse me, they cry out to Moses, but Moses is in the same boat. He's facing the same situation. He's got the water on one side, and he's got the army on the other. But I love his response, because they get terrified and they cry out, and Moses, facing the exact same way, this is how he responds. He tells the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians, I love this, the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Wow. That's a bold statement. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. So, what happened? God acted. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all through the night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind. He turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. And after they had crossed over safely, God brought the waters back and swept away the Egyptian army, and the Israelites were safe. Just as Moses had told them. It happened exactly as he had told them. And that leads to the third characteristic of leadership and leading in challenging times. People will be unhappy. People are going to be unhappy. Over 400 years, the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt. They had watched as God brought 10 plagues on that country. 10 horrible things. 10 things that broke all the laws of science. These things shouldn't happen, and they happened. And God made it happen. God told them it was going to happen, and he did it. They knew about the covenant promise that God had made with Abraham, when he said, I will be your God, you will be my people. That was a promise, and they knew that. God himself made them a promise. If you're flipping, now you got to flip all the way back. Chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. This is the promise that God made to the Israelites. Listen to these words. This is amazing, what this promise. I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people. I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land that I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. That was his promise to them. That's pretty cool. I'm going to rescue you. I'm going to guard you. I'm going to guide you. I'm going to give you this land that I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I mean, the big three, father figures in their history. This is the promise that God himself made to the Israelites. They knew this. They had witnessed 10 plagues, just destroy this country of Egypt. And their response was to complain. You know that phrase, what have you done for me lately? You ever heard that? Yeah. They got sucked into that line of thinking. That's what they got sucked into. It's like after all of this that had happened, after the promises, after God had demonstrated his power, after Pharaoh finally relenting and letting them go, and after beginning their journey to this land that God had promised to give them to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, at the very first sign of trouble, it's like they'd forgotten everything that they had seen and heard. So they find themselves between a rock and a hard place. We know how Moses responded, right? Don't be afraid. Have faith. God promised he would deliver us. And look at their response. It's in chapter 14, verses 11 and 12. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. That's their response. All they've seen and witnessed and heard, the promises that have been made, and they're like, we should never have left. This is, we shouldn't have gone. Now, we're not going to go into it, but they do a lot more complaining in the future, so they really don't ever learn their lesson. But you're going to hear about that in coming weeks. But the key here is even after doing so much for them, even after making all of these promises to them, and even after the promises that he'd already kept, even after the miraculous power that's been displayed, the people complained. They weren't happy. They actually wanted to go back to Egypt. All right, so that actually catches us up through 11 chapters. Look at that. Not bad. Not bad. Not bad. But, I mean, okay, so a story about complaining people and a guy leading them and stuff like that, thousands of years ago, it makes for a good movie. We got some good movies. Pastor Mark mentioned The Prince of Egypt in Disney. I'm more of a Charlton Heston kind of guy, the let my people. I said in the first service, someday, I don't know exactly how heaven works, but Moses is one of the people that I'd like to meet if we're allowed to meet people from the past. I'm telling you right now, if he doesn't sound like James Earl Jones, if he walks up to me and says, hey, I'm Moses, how you doing? I don't know. It's going to be interesting. What does it have to do with us? What's this have to do with us today? Well, a lot. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to answer the question that we do most Sundays. So 3, 2, 1, let's ask it. So what? Story of plagues, story of the Passover, story of the march to the Red Sea and the parting of the waters has a lot to teach us about us and how we live today. Especially has a lot to teach us about leadership and what it means to lead in challenging times. So let me ask you, I got two questions for you. Here's the first one. Just show of hands. How many of you think that we're living in a challenging time right now? Maurice, two? Yeah. Yeah, challenging times, very challenging times. A lot of stuff going on in this world, a lot of unease, unanswered questions, confusion. Second question, how many of you consider yourselves leaders? Wow. Wow, not very many hands going up here. Well, here's the first thing that I would really like you to listen to if you haven't been listening up to this point very much. I would like you to hear this. Every single one of you is a leader in some way, shape, or form. You might not be a leader of 2 million people out of slavery in a country. Okay, neither am I. But every one of us is a leader in some way, shape, or form because God has called you to lead at work, at home, at church, in your neighborhood, in various groups that you're a part of. If you're part of a knitting club, you're actually supposed to be a leader in the knitting club. You are called to be coaches, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, fifth cousins. There's all of us have been called to lead in some way, shape, or form. You know, when Pastor Dan approached me a few years ago about impact and participating in impact, one of the reasons that I got excited and wanted to get involved, because that's kind of what impact recognizes, is the importance of kids leading in school. Even kids are called to lead. Even at a young age, they can learn about leading. It's what happens at Awana and at Discovery Town and VBS and our preschool. And I know I'm talking about all the kids stuff, but that's my world. In fact, it's really cool. I like speaking on Sundays because I get to come to the big building. And I like that. I get to see big people. But it happens here with adults too, with our growth groups and Sunday schools and all of the different things that we do. But it all ties into this fact and this recognition that we're all leaders in some way, shape, or form. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So, in case you haven't realized it yet, this is an election year. I don't know if any of you have gotten spam calls yet. I probably have gotten 3 while I'm talking. But it's an election year, and it's a very important thing. Obviously, elections are very important things, but I would like you to hear this second thing from me. And I really would like you to listen. Everybody here, you will have a greater impact on the lives of people in Jamestown and Lakewood and Faulkner and Frewsburg and Mayville and Randolph and Bemis Point and Busti and Warren and any other little town that I forgot to mention around here. You will have a greater impact and influence on the lives of the people of these communities than Joe Biden or Donald Trump ever will. You will. You influence and impact my life more than Mayor Eklund or Governor Hochul or any other elected official we have. You impact and influence me way more than they ever could. You have more impact than any politician. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we are called to live lives that are different than the standards of this world. You've probably heard it say, be in the world but not of it. We live here, but our standards are different. They are different than the standards of this world. And so how we live, our actions, our words, our thoughts, our opinions, our attitudes, all of these things should be setting an example and leading others towards Christ. And in that way, we are all leaders. We are to be examples. And so as leaders living in a challenging world, we are going to face the things that Moses faced. So that is what Moses has to do with us thousands of years later. We will face opposition. People will hate you. They're going to. People will work against you. People will try to stop you from doing the things that they're doing. They'll gossip about you. you are going to face opposition. I just mentioned, getting to be a part of Impact. We've been facing that with the Jamestown School District and all the stuff we've been going on with them. But here's the thing, and I actually got frustrated with myself about this. When all of this came up, it kind of caught us off guard and took us by surprise. And I look back and I think, John, why did it catch you by surprise? Why didn't you expect this? We should expect that to happen. It shouldn't surprise us. And it did. And it shouldn't. Because we are going to face opposition. You'll face it at work. You'll face it in your community. For some people, you'll even face it in your very own homes. But then the question becomes, what are we going to do? What will we do with it? Because it's human nature to feel intimidated in the face of opposition. It's easy to shrink back. It's easy to just keep our mouth shut. How many of you heard this phrase? Just keep the peace. Just keep the peace. Just keep the peace. What does keep the peace usually mean? I'm just going to go back and here and hide. That's what keeping the peace is. Opposition is uncomfortable. Nobody likes to be disliked. Nobody wants their reputation called into question. But the thing is, that doesn't work. You can't shrink back, and you can't just close your mouth and run off and hide. There was a British pastor serving, end of 1800s, beginning of 1900s. His name was G. Campbell Morgan. And I love this quote of him. He said, "If you have no opposition in the place you serve, you're serving in the wrong place." I like that. If everything's going swimmingly, you might need to start asking some questions. Now, what would have happened if Moses, when he saw the Egyptian army, had told everyone, run, hide, find a rock? That would not have worked out very well. But he didn't do that. He stood firm. He trusted in the promise and the word of God and became an example to the others of how to respond in the face of an impossible situation, because that's what a leader does. They set the example. That's why we're leaders. We're here to set the example. And so as leaders living in a challenging world, we are going to face seemingly impossible tasks. We will face challenges where we simply don't know what to do. Have you ever felt that? Found yourself in a situation, go, I don't know what to do here. Can't see a way out. I just had that happen. We just planted a whole bunch of flowers, and these stinking Japanese beetles came and chewed them all up, and I'm like, well, this is just great. And Heather's like, why don't we just hang a bag out in the yard? And there's like 100 of those things in there now, and the flowers are safe. I'm glad, but I'm ready to throw my hands up and whatever. There'll be times when we feel trapped. We feel that way, feel like Moses, feel like the Israelites. So what do we do in this situation? Do we want to turn tail like the Israelites did, or do we do what Moses did? And I know it sounds so simple, almost too simplistic, but it's what the Bible keeps telling us over and over and over. Trust God. That's what Moses did. He goes, God's going to fight the fight. You just need to be still. Trust God. Folks, we serve the God of the impossible. He loves it. He loves doing the impossible. We serve the God of the insurmountable. We serve the God who parted those waters. We couldn't do that. He did it. We serve a God who destroyed the walls of Jericho with a trumpet. With a trumpet. We serve the God who stood in flames with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they came out unscathed. We serve a God who destroyed sin and death. Jesus himself told us, all things are possible with God. All things. That's the God we serve. He's the same God. He said, I'm the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So the God that was talking to Moses is the God who's with us today. And that's the promise that he made, is that he will fight the fight. We just need to be still. So at work, at home, at church, in your community, wherever you are facing something and you just don't see a way out, trust that God will provide the way out. because that's what he said he will do. I will make a way when there seems to be no way. It's what he's done in the past, and he said, I am the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. What he has done in the past, he promises to do in the future. And folks, as leaders, we live in a challenging world. Guess what? You're going to make people unhappy. I know that probably comes as a shock to you. I know it probably comes as a shock. Right? People love to complain. My goodness, it's why I don't go on social media anymore. I can't, it's like complain fest. People love to complain. You know, I've been in ministry for like 23, 24 years now, and met a lot of people in my life, and I'm convinced that there are people in this world who are not happy unless they're unhappy. And I know that sounds like doesn't compute, but I'm really convinced that there are people who are not happy unless they're unhappy. Just wallow in it. Moses did not make everybody happy. People grumbled and complained against him a lot. Paul, the Apostle Paul, did he make people happy all the time? He spent half his life in jail. I mean, goodness gracious. The other half, he spent trying not to get killed. That was Paul. How about Jesus? How'd that work out for him? You think he made everybody happy? No. And you will not either, because when you follow God's call in your life, when you live your life the way he wants you to, it will upset people. It'll upset your coworkers, it'll upset your friends, it'll upset people in the community. It may even upset some people in your family. That is going to happen. But when it comes to following Jesus Christ, we have to ask ourselves two questions. First, what is it that God wants of me? And second, how will people react? The problem is when you're placing more importance on the second question than the first, you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems. Following God means that you are going to ruffle some feathers, and you have to learn to be okay with that. And that's a hard thing to learn how to do, to ruffle feathers and be okay with it, because being obedient to God is more important than anything else. Faithfulness is more important than popularity.